Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Let's see. This is Sunday, March the 15th, 2020, and you're tuned to WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM. This is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, conservation, nature, and whatever else Dave has been up to. Do you want to take just a moment and make sure people remember, you've probably heard that while people may be fine right at the moment, there is this virus that's impending, and the best things that you can do are cough and sneeze into your elbow, sanitize yourself frequently, especially after every time that you sneeze or cough. Stay away from people who are sick. If you become sick, please stay home. Take that time off to, as they said in the last program, to take some time for yourself and sanitize frequently, and be sure and wash your hands thoroughly. That means palms of hands, backs of hands, fingers and fingernails, 20 seconds. You keep hearing happy birthday, sing it twice. You know, you take any verse of a blues tune, like the ones we were just listening to. That takes about 20 seconds to work your way through one verse of the blues. So you can be different. You don't have to sing the exact same song that everyone else does. Did I mention that the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else? Back to you, Dave.
I thought we'd try something different. A lot of people ask me how we got into buying up our railroad beds for Prairie and for trails and for possible re-rail. So I thought I might just run through that. Some of it you've heard before, but it doesn't hurt to put it into context. And one of the things we find with fundraising is that it's often important to let people know who you are and what you do, and it often includes personalities. I was at the WEF meeting the other night, and we were talking about fundraising, and I was tempted to say that it's often important to let people know about the individual people that are working the outfit and keeping it afloat. And then I thought, well, perhaps I ought to do the same sort of thing for ourselves. This is something we did on the spur of the moment. So I thought I'd start with my parents and my background in Australia, because often what you do follows what your family does. And so my father was the 14th child, born in the late 1800s, and he grew up in an era when churches were big deals. This is where you had your gymnasiums. This is where you had educational opportunity. The schools were not as big in his day. So he studied and became a congregational parson. He did that for 5 years, but felt that he was not as godly as his congregation, so he left the church. He was mainly using the church as a teacher of moral code, and that was not an unusual thing to do in those days. He went to school teaching, trained for school teaching, taught in Sydney for a while, the main city of Australia, and went to school teaching. My mother grew up in Cockney territory in London, Croydon, London, and her father was a tailor of note. He was on Savile Row. Savile Row was a place where tailors of respect were lined up, and still are. he decided to move to Australia. England was the seat of the British Commonwealth, and one of the things that they did was to produce people for colonization. So at some stage the sun never set on British colonies, and so grandfather decided to go to Australia, and with short notice my 13-year-old mother left with her 2 sisters and boarded a boat that had to circumvent World War I submarines and war vessels that were part of World War I. They went by Cape Hope and across the Bight of Australia and up the east coast to Sydney. They didn't have much money left, so they set up tailoring, and my mother was a seamstress as well as father was the tailor. And my mother studied art, and part of her job that she took on was with an organization that would have my mother to sketch latest fashions. So she would have to go to races and other places, and then she was in charge of 18 seamstresses who would create a more practical and saleable at a secondary level of fashion. She met my father at his church, and while he was in Sydney training and teaching, he made all his furniture. He had been a cabinet maker before he went into the church. So in Australia, the people are assigned by the state government, and so he was assigned to a small copper mining town where the copper mine had closed. So you had a village of people who were miners surrounded by ranchers that were raising cattle and sheep, and were very different. My father had the school teachers in those sorts of communities are often the center of social activity. They help with dances and community events and voting behavior and things like that. He also had a small pocket farm with a cow and the grazing and oats and barley to keep the cow. They had a pet kangaroo that had been thrown out by the mother that was being hunted. And people knew that was likely to happen, so they would capture the young kangaroo, and they gave this one to my parents. And so they had an experience at a place called Gulf Creek in northwestern New South Wales. They were invited to go nearer to the coast, underneath the foot of an escarpment, where plate tectonics is one plate tectonic is moving over another, and so we were there with a 2,000-foot mountain on one side and other mountains surrounding, and a river that ran in front of the mountain and then out to the Pacific Ocean. Father was the one teacher, school teacher, with the same social responsibilities as previously, and my mother taught sewing, and in an era when housewives were housewives and were not out doing other things, but she had to handle people that were students, and it was in a high rainfall area, 80 inches a year, and sometimes we would have waterfalls on the mountain, and sometimes the mountain would be afire with lightning struck fires that would burn the bark of the eucalypts that shed bark readily, and periodically the lightning strikes, and that was interesting. On top of the hill there was some volcanic activity as plates, geologic plates moved. There was outpouring of some magma that gave rise to very good soils, whereas the basic plates were uplifted from under the ocean and very leached. So you could come across that mountain and all of a sudden find a rainforest in amongst trees that were suffering from living on a low nutrition soil, and soils like sandstone or underground rock like sandstone, limestone, shale, slates that didn't retain the water. So very different ecosystems. We were a long way from high school, so I went to an agricultural boarding school where the students were also the people who handled livestock and agriculture. My brother went to stay with relatives in Sydney and went to an urban high school. That background, I had a sister, and she became a teacher also. I taught at a high school, and a similar one to where I grew up. It was all-male boarding school, and it serviced people who were a long way away from a high school situation. My brother became an engineer and worked with the Shire, which is like a county, and he was a county engineer and married there, and has recently passed away there. I came to the U.S. to get a higher degree. It was a master's degree I was looking for, and came here with a curiosity as to Americans, and it's not always a very understood country. The difference between Maine and Texas is real. The immigrant population is very various and with ethnic backgrounds. And in Australia, I had been very interested in the Australian ecosystem, which is really quite unusual, whether it's animal or plant. And I assumed the same sort of thing would be here. I was surprised to find that there was very little prairie left. It's on soils that are very rich from Canada and other places that are rich in soil nutriments, and the prairie that grew there was often very wet and in swampland, and not easy to occupy. So Champaign County was one of the last counties to be developed in Illinois because it was wet. There were a few outliers of trees, big groves, and that's where most of the settlers found a home. Was the groves provided lumber and protection from the wind, and you could take down a few trees and have a garden, and so some of the early settlement was in those groves. I eventually found out where the prairie was. It's mainly along railroad lines that by happenstance have a law that says that you can't occupy the land alongside the railroad, even though the right-of-way is about 100 feet wide. So I started to get interested in railroads, and especially by the time I was here, the people had come back from World War II. They had been driving tanks and trucks and vehicles, and they found that much more convenient than being on trains. Trains had replaced people coming up the water corridors, but then the trains were being replaced by highways and airlines. So standing in the middle of this east central Illinois, where abandonments were many, the area had been platted, so there were north, south, east, west plats, so that if you bought a site unseen in Europe and you wanted to come here and find it, you could find it. The elevators were about 5 miles apart and about 8 miles for a horse or a team to travel with a load of grain. And those short lines were getting to be obsolete. The grain yield was getting greater. There was more concrete elevators, and the trucks and semi-trailers would take the grain more conveniently. It didn't necessarily pay for the roads, but they were used. And I was very aware that this is what our only prairie is. I can remember standing just a little bit west of Monticello and standing on a track where the railroad spikes had been taken out enough that the rails could be removed. The plates were loose, so a kind of a snowplow was used to push the ribbons of rail to one side. I forget how they were picked up. In this case, it might have been in sticks, which are 33 feet long, onto semi-trailers. I didn't really see the other alternative is to wind quarter-mile lengths up onto a flatbed train. And those materials are worth a lot of money because they're good steel and they can be used for re-rail. And railroads aren't necessarily outmoded. They, the main lines are very much of attention now. If you're in Champaign and you count the number of cars behind a couple of engines and a pusher engine in the middle or at the end, then there's 200 cars. So the railroads are doing well, but still there are abandonments. I started to ask questions about who owned these corridors had help from very helpful Scott family who looked at the titles, because the titles of railroad lines are not always good. Some are warranty deeds, which is very much a good ownership. The railroad company owns that. Easement mean that you are various forms of easement where you can go back, or the land can go back to the adjacent farmer. So knowing what we were going to get, I went to Chicago and to the Prudential Building and asked if we could buy the land but have time to acquire the money to pay for it. I was there for several days. It was not a very usual way of doing things. Eventually, Illinois Central decided that we were for real and they would give us time to get the money. And we did. We got the money. So there we were with a railroad bed in 3 different sections, adjacent to a railroad museum and adjacent to a grain line from Monticello into Decatur. We had on those lines a lot of prairie. We also had easements for power. And power lines in that era were still removing trees with axes and chainsaws, and that changed. They discovered herbicide, and all of a sudden herbicide could be used. So some of the prairie that we bought for Prairie was lost to a modernization of the easement maintenance. We had 3 pieces. One was between Whiteheath and Seymour, and one was between Whiteheath and Clinton, and one was on one end of a 7-mile railroad bed that was used with the rails intact by the Railroad Museum. There was another piece between Monticello and Cisco. We took time and energy to see whether the elevators wanted to retain the bed for future use. It was eventually decided that they could avoid that, but top flight elevators that they meant could possibly take grain from Cisco via Monticello. The city of Monticello was, like other agencies, not willing to help buy the land, but once the land was bought, they were very interested in doing what we had suggested, which was a trail. They put in it at their own cost a mile of trail, and they kept it narrow enough that the vegetation on either side, the bottomland forest and the like, was retained. The corridor went over a nice truss bridge so that you can stand on the bridge and see the river. Prior to there being a trail put in there, we had added additional bridge ties so that you didn't freak out as you were walking across the trestle and the bridge. And that sufficed for quite some time. The small subdevelopments on the west side of the Sangamon River used that corridor to get to Old Town on the east side, and they could do it without going on Bridge Road, which is a outlet from a Cloverleaf 72. We had another mile added because of the popularity of this, and that's still going through development. This last year, budgeting was for the concreting of that extra mile. Concrete is used because you can repair concrete locally, but if you do something like asphalt, you have to have a contract with people that come in with hot asphalt, and it's a much more difficult thing to do, and you have to have contracts and the like that are awkward. So usually the trails are first gravel, chip limestone, and then when more sophisticated, they get to be concreted. Very popular. Yeah. And there is the vegetation on either side. From Monticello to Cisco, there remained 4 miles that we're rather proud to have as Prairie, and it remains so. It's been invaded to some extent by trees that don't really belong, so we have a lot of work to do there. But if the time came that we could put a narrow trail in there, that would be a possibility for the future. But all in all, we were early inspired and were doing what would happen later when the federal government saw that rail, trail, and greenway people were buying railroad lines and having some problems with titles and bridges that were removed. So the federal government was working through their agency, which is called the Surface Transportation Board. They decided that they would give money to the development of bicycle trails, and they would use the bicycle people as one more public use for that corridor, with the proviso that the people could come back, railroads could come back in if necessary. So we were in advance of that, but we were aware of it, and we were watching carefully a Conrail retirement between Danville and Urbana. And we tried to encourage local agencies that were interested in natural history to buy that bed for the natural history and for trails. So no one would take the risk of buying, for a relatively modest amount, the bed. So we promised to buy. Other agencies then were, once we had gone through some of the hack work, it was felt that this was a very good idea, and other agencies wanted to take over. Unfortunately, didn't get the money that we did get for the Western Trail through Monticello. The money was reasonably huge, $12 million for the 25 miles, plus state money, plus adjunct money from other agencies, and private donations, which were considerable. So you're talking about a multi-million-dollar process, and it was dead for about 20 years until it was revitalized, and it has become a very popular trail. It's been developed in sections. The first section between Urbana and St. Joe is 7 miles long. Excuse me. It is proven to be very useful. Bikes and walking people use it. At the end of the trail, there's economic development of a restaurant that is utilized. So these trails often bring together communities. Even commuters can commute by bicycle. The area between St. Joe and Oakwood has not been developed yet, but it is loaded with prairie and prairie soils on either side. Our disappointment has been that the section between Urbana and St. Joe has become more of a recreational trail rather than a preservational trail. It's in the hands of the Forest Preserve, which is kind of a misnomer in Champaign County because 94% of the county was prairie. But trees are an attraction, and everyone loves a tree, can hug a tree. But prairie looks like weeds and often has invasive weeds in it. The little section between St. Joe and Mayview was an area where early ecologists worked with the Big Four, which was the agency at the time, to do ecology there, whether it be research or whether it was teaching. And that area has been devastated by the width of the trail and the need for EPA to put 8 inches of soil or gravel on the top of the rail bed because there may be leftover creosote there. And then they go down the sides, and by the time that has happened, you don't have any vegetation left. So there was George Fell, who studied at the University of Illinois, but then with, I'm sure, the support of ecologists, Vestal and Kendi and others, they encouraged George Fell to go off to Washington, and he created the Nature Conservancy. So there's an agency that now is worldwide, and there's our history, and it's devastated. And we don't want that 15 mile between St. Joe and Oakwood to suffer the same problem. Recreation always trumps preservation, and when you're down to the state having preserved 0.01% of the 2/3 prairie that they had, this is serious stuff. So we hope that you will take an interest in this corridor. But the story is there. We've worked at the private level as well as at the public level, and we've been an inspiration which didn't seem to be there with any other agency. We've sort of been left out on the side as far as development is concerned, but that's okay. It may not have been there if we hadn't taken out the interim trail use agreement with the federal government. So we don't have money for the preservation of that 15 miles. So that's where we have to be careful to see that happens. We're watching very carefully the success of the Quick-Hickory Trail. There are no other long-distance trails in East Central Illinois. There is one coming up between Bloomington and Mansfield. and it's adjacent to roads. And also, if your road, as usual, paralleled the railroad lines, it's always tempting from a developmental point of view to widen out of the railroad bed. So I'm anticipating that if we're not very careful, where the railroad bed parallels the road will be 150 will be expanded into the prairie. And bingo goes another piece of our only prairie. We worked for years to preserve 30 miles of prairie in the Arcola, Arthur, Lovington area, Paris, and that has been returned to farmers because they're hungry for an extra few rows of corn and soybeans, and under the railroad ballast there is good prairie soil. So we've lost that, and we're likely to lose other trails if we're not very careful. So I would encourage some of you to think about taking your vehicle and going between Mansfield and Farmer City and Bloomington to see what you could do to preserve the prairie that's on that corridor. It often gets mown, so there are movements afloat within the state to care for roadside habitat. And that's causing a problem because with the invention of rotary mowers in just after World War II, there has been a sociological interest in mowing. It almost says that as an interest in neatness and tidiness, and prairie especially doesn't look interesting in that way. So as the move afoot to preserve prairie has come up on roadside signs, you will see them there about 15 feet away from the roadside that say, please don't mow on the upside of the ditch. And that has actually taken out jobs for people who mow with large 15-foot batwing mowers. So it has saved the state a lot of money, but has also denied people employment. And that's a controversial situation at the moment. On South 45, we've had areas mown that have not been mown for 30 years, and that's part of the problem. Neatness versus habitat. We're also looking at railroad right-of-way between Rantoul and Paxton, and further north to Buckley and north into Park Forest South. There's a lot of prairie on adjacent to the railroad right-of-way. In some places, from Rantoul to Paxton, for instance, we have an old interurban which has been retired, and it's loaded with prairie. And then there's also the fact that Route 47 was going to be developed as a dual highway, but 57 was put in, and there was no need anymore. But the land had been bought, and so that gives extra space for roadside development. Both Old 45, which has been replaced by 57, that takes a lot of the traffic. You have a highway which is not very active in terms of transportation use, and that makes it possible to have drive-ins or kiosks or notification that this is our ecosystem and it's valuable. We have bought 9.5 acres at the south end and hope to expand that by another 5 acres just north of Rantoul. There's another rail trail that goes east-west on what was called an old pumpkin vine. And that used to go through to Lafayette, Indiana. We walked it, and it became a topic for an early first in this area Prairie conference. It was quite successful. It was held at Muhammad. And then subsequently, Grand Prairie Friends was formed, and we had a lot to do with that. We had a lot to do with the legal base of it. We worked with Bob Dodd, who'd been mayor of Champaign and knew when we were asking for funds to do prairie preservation. He has passed, but the people that he mentored and worked with have formed their own legal organization, and I was interested to have some people visit me just yesterday to discuss the legalities and the excitement of doing these things. You have to be careful. If you run in and do things quickly before the community is ready for it, it won't happen. We are in criticism at the moment for not going with a trail between Monticello and Allerton Park. Part of the reason is that once the state gets involved, it makes it a recreational trail, and then you lose the prairie that we have cherished. So we've said no to that development, and that is hurtful to people who have the intention to develop. Sometimes they want to develop just the low-hanging fruit, the ideal settings, like the one from Whiteheath down to Shady Rest, whereas we would like them to look at the whole 33 miles. So you look at the overall and accept the problems that go with it. It's not easy stuff. We would also like to have public agencies be the contributors rather than private agencies. We are often dependent on agencies like the Clean Air Foundation, Clean Energy Foundation, which is basically Commonwealth Edison. It has enough money to be able to decide whether they can help with natural area preservation, and they do a very good job. But in ways it's tainted money because it doesn't give the community or the state or the federal government the chance to vote what they would want to support. And so we have some conflict with that situation where money can dominate principles, and we sometimes have to work for 15 or 20 years with people to say, yes, you have money and you want this and that done, but we would like to have this and that done. And then it may take a long time for people to be involved in preserving a dignified overall corridor. The federal government has done very well at this. As the railroads retired and the growth of a rail trail organization evolved, and it now has something like 20,000 miles of active rail trails, and many of those are rail trails that are supported by federal money to put them into action. So it's a growing organization. It has the support of both parties because both parties want to save the nature that's on the side, and the attraction of these corridors is that they bring together communities. Those elevators that are 5 miles apart, children move back and forth along the corridor. They do that on our corridors even though they're not developed yet. Our difficulty is that we haven't had that federal money. We preceded the federal interim trail use agreements, and we have a lot of homework to do to develop that license to be existing alongside farm situations. And the farmers have been very good. There's just one or two that have pulled in from the side, with leaving our corridor. One especially has taken over the corridor, and that means we have to do legal work to maintain our right-of-way, which in that case is a warranty deed, which is very good ownership of the corridor. We think worldwide, and I'm just dreaming about a very nice corridor in Australia, which goes up to the Mount Kosciuszko, which is snow-clad. It's Australia's highest peak. There are all sorts of captures of water with dams on the east coast where the rivers flow to the Pacific, and then channels through the mountains to provide electricity and to provide irrigation on the west side of the mountains. It's kind of drier. So you hope that people that you might be talking to here might be in other places doing things with rail trails. I've got to watch my time here. I've got 5 minutes. And I think that's our first attempt to say something about personality, and how do you tie other people onto that personality? How do you spin things off like the Grand Prairie Friends and a Natural Areas Study Group and Heartland Pathways? And how do you develop the people who have the expertise to create easements, conservation easements, and to work with villages and communities to explain what the value is of preserving that little piece of dignity along the railroad beds. David and I went not too long ago to Weldon, and there was quite a bit of reaction to the fact that that was weeds, but it is not weeds. In amongst the weeds are the prairie plants, and with a little bit of tender loving care, you can bring back the prairie. And that has to be explained over and over, and sometimes it has been the experience of other agencies that a very unwilling adjacent owner took about 15 years to convince himself that this was a very valuable thing to do, and then some of those people become your best supporters, and they teach others. And so when we go to Prairie State Conservation Coalition meetings, we're talking to people who had to do that sort of thing. Joe Davies County in the northwest corner at the moment is developing a lot because Chicago finds it to be a bedroom community for retirees and others, and surprisingly, they have asked for funds for natural areas expansion, and got much more than they ever expected. Kickstart programs work, and but you got to select your timing, and you have to not always win. You have to try, and if it tries and doesn't work, you sometimes learn from that experience. So we hope that we will probably do this not only with ERES and Heartland Pathways next door, but also with WEFT. We'll try and give you a personality look to see who and what and how people are working with some of these nebulous situations. I want to say something very different. There's a hazardous waste pickup from in Champaign on the 4th of April, a Saturday, and I really encourage you to register. You have to register to your plot, and you have to arrive at a certain time. That saves you having 2 miles of cars that are moving an inch at a time and boiling and whatnot. So you don't get this opportunity very often. I'm a little sad that often a lot of materials go into one big bin and get to be transferred to Kansas or some other place and buried in a situation where they're known. But a lot of these materials are recyclable if people would work with them. Like latex paints can be combined together, or soap materials can be actually reused, and lead-based paints can be in another situation. But that's a costly challenge. So think about recycling your hazardous waste. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.